There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They don't announce themselves with thunder or fanfare. They slip in through a side door, dressed in the quiet fabric of a Tuesday night, or the low hum of a refrigerator in a sleeping apartment. You don't recognize them as turning points until much later, when you trace the map of your life backward and find a single, unassuming pin pressed into the timeline. For me, that pin was the sound of Julian's breathing in the near dark of my living room. It was a sound I had heard before, of course, during movie nights or after long, rambling conversations that bled into the early morning. But this time was different. This was the first night he had shown up broken, and the sound of his sleep was not the easy, untroubled rhythm of a friend crashing on a couch, but the deep, weighted cadence of a man seeking sanctuary. A ship seeking a harbor in a storm he could not yet name. He was a landscape of careful stillness on my sofa, one arm thrown over his eyes to block the sliver of moonlight that cut through the blinds, the other resting on his chest, rising and falling with each breath. I had been sitting in the armchair across from him for what must have been an hour, a book lying open and unread in my lap. I couldn't focus on the words. My attention was an anchor dropped deep into the space he occupied, snagged on the details of his existence in my home. The worn fabric of his jeans, the way his socks had slipped halfway off his feet, the faint scent of rain and coffee that clung to his jacket, which was slung over the back of my chair. It was an invasion of a sort, but one I had invited. One I had been silently inviting for years. My apartment had always been my fortress, a curated space of quiet and order, a reflection of the carefully constructed walls I maintained around myself. And here was Julian, sleeping within those walls, fundamentally altering the architecture of my solitude with nothing more than his presence. I found myself cataloging the moment, the way I do when I'm looking through the lens of my camera. I framed the shot in my mind, the cool blue light from the window painting the edges of his silhouette, the deep shadows pooling in the hollow of his throat and the space between his lips parted just slightly. It was a portrait of exhaustion, of a vulnerability he rarely showed the world. Julian was motion. He was bright, kinetic energy, a whirlwind of confident gestures and easy laughter that drew people into his orbit. He moved through life with a certainty I had always admired and perhaps envied. But here, in the quiet shelter of my apartment, the motion had ceased. The storm had passed over, for a few hours at least, leaving this profound stillness in its wake. And in that stillness, I felt a dangerous, familiar ache bloom in my chest. It was the ache of a love I had long ago decided to file away, to label as friendship and lock in a room I never visited. But the door to that room, I was beginning to realize, had never been properly locked. It had been left just slightly ajar, and Julian, in his unknowing desperation, had just pushed it wide open. Watching him sleep, I understood that the ordinary moment of a friend crashing on my couch was not ordinary at all. It was the beginning of a tectonic shift, a slow, imperceptible grinding of plates beneath the surface of our lives that would eventually, inevitably, change the landscape forever. I didn't know where it would lead, but I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and thrilling, that nothing would ever be quite the same again. We met at a housewarming party, which feels almost like a cliché, a pre-written scene from a romantic comedy I would never have cast myself in. It was our mutual friend Sarah's place, a sprawling apartment downtown that was still filled with the ghosts of unpacked boxes and the scent of fresh paint. The air was thick with the forced conviviality of strangers trying to find common ground. A cacophony of competing conversations and music played just a little too loud. I was never good in those environments. I tended to find a corner, a peripheral space where I could observe without having to fully participate, my camera often serving as a convenient shield. That night, however, I had left it at home, determined to make an effort to be present. It was a resolution that lasted approximately 15 minutes, until I found myself nursing a warm beer by a window overlooking the glittering, indifferent city, feeling as transparent and unnoticed as the glass I was leaning against. And then he was there, He didn't so much enter my space as he simply materialized beside me, as if the party had decided to coalesce its most vibrant energy into a single person and place him at my elbow. "Hiding?" he asked, and his voice was exactly as I would have expected, warm, with a low, amused timbre that made the simple question feel like an inside joke we now shared. I remember turning to look at him properly for the first time, and it was like adjusting the focus on a lens until the world snaps into sharp, breathtaking clarity. He was all easy smiles and bright, intelligent eyes that seemed to be taking in everything at once. He had this way of holding himself, a relaxed confidence that wasn't arrogant, but simply comfortable in its own skin. He was talking to me, and for the first time all night, I didn't feel like I was performing a version of myself. His name was Julian. He said it while extending a hand, and I took it, my own feeling clumsy and cold in his warm, firm grip. I told him my name, Leo, and the way he repeated it was the first hook. He didn't just say it. He tested it, tasted it. "Leo," he said again, slower this time, a small smile playing on his lips as if he'd just been given a gift he was deciding where to put. "I like that. It's a solid name." In that moment, surrounded by the noise and anonymity of the party, he made me feel seen. He made my name, a sound I had heard my entire life, feel new and significant. We stood by that window for over an hour, the party receding into a dull roar around us. He was a consultant, he told me, which meant he spent most of his time on planes and in sterile hotel rooms, translating complex data for people in suits. It sounded exhausting, but he spoke about it with a passionate, articulate energy. I told him I was a photographer, and his eyes lit up. He didn't ask the usual, polite questions about whether I did weddings. Instead, he asked what I saw. "What do you look for?" he'd asked, leaning in slightly. "When you look at the world through a lens." It was a question that disarmed me entirely. No one had ever asked me that. They asked about my equipment, my clients, my rates. Julian asked about my soul. I found myself trying to explain the unexplainable, the hunt for a certain quality of light, the way a shadow can tell a more compelling story than the object casting it, the quiet poetry in the mundane. And he listened. He didn't just wait for his turn to speak. He absorbed my words, his gaze fixed on mine, nodding in understanding. It felt like a conversation I had been waiting my whole life to have. We discovered a shared love for old black and white films, for rainy days spent indoors, for the specific, melancholic beauty of cities at dusk. It was a rapid, dizzying freefall into familiarity. By the end of the night, when the party was winding down and the air was stale with the remnants of celebration, it felt less like I had met a stranger and more like I had found a missing part of my own personal geography. Our friendship grew from that night, quickly and effortlessly, like a vine finding the perfect wall to climb. It was built on a foundation of late-night phone calls when he was lonely in some anonymous hotel in a city I'd never seen, and long, meandering walks through the city on the rare weekends he was home. He became a fixture in my life. He was the person I sent photos to before I showed anyone else, seeking his opinion not as a critic, but as a trusted eye. He was the one who could pull me out of my own head when I was spiraling into a creative slump, showing up at my door with takeout and a stupid movie, his presence a silent permission to stop striving and just be. For my part, I became his anchor. My apartment was his decompression chamber, the one place he didn't have to be on. He could walk in, drop his bags, and just breathe. He'd talk for hours about the pressures of his job, the endless performance, the gnawing loneliness of a life lived in transit. I would just listen, making him tea, offering a quiet space for the noise in his head to settle. For the first year, it was easy. It was the purest, most uncomplicated friendship I had ever known. He was dating someone then, a woman named Chloe. She was nice enough, smart and ambitious, a perfect match for the public-facing version of Julian. I was happy for him, genuinely. Or, I told myself I was. The first crack in that comfortable self-deception appeared on a rainy autumn afternoon. Julian was at my place, sprawled on my floor, helping me sort through a mountain of prints for a gallery submission. Chloe was supposed to join us, but she'd canceled at the last minute. He was complaining good-naturedly about her work schedule, and then he looked up at me, a stray lock of dark hair falling across his forehead. He smiled, a tired but genuine smile, and said, "You know, this is better anyway. It's easier here. With you." And the way he said it, with this unguarded sincerity, sent something shifting inside me. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic revelation. It was more like noticing a change in the light at the end of a long day, a subtle shift from gold to blue that signals the coming of night. It was the realization that the comfort and peace I felt when he was around wasn't just friendship. It was something deeper, something more resonant. It was the low, steady hum of love. The realization terrified me. I saw, with perfect clarity, the two paths that lay before me. One was to say something, to risk the most important relationship in my life on the vanishingly small chance that he felt the same way. The other was to bury it, to build a fortress around that feeling and live within its walls, preserving the beautiful, essential thing we already had. I chose the fortress. I became a master of emotional architecture, constructing walls of plausible deniability, decorating my affection in the safe, unassuming colors of platonic friendship. I learned to interpret his casual touches, a hand on my shoulder, a playful nudge, as nothing more than they appeared to be. I learned to ignore the way my heart would stutter when he'd call me from 1,000 miles away, his voice rough with sleep, just to say hello. It was an act of profound self-preservation. Our friendship was a rare and precious ecosystem, and I was not going to be the one to introduce an invasive species, no matter how much I might have wanted to. I became the quiet observer of my own heart, documenting its secret yearning from a safe distance, convinced that this was the only way to keep him in my life. I was good at it. For a long time, I was very, very good at it. The shift began subtly, as most significant changes do. It wasn't a singular event, but a series of tremors that preceded the earthquake. The first tremor was the end of Julian and Chloe. It wasn't a dramatic, explosive breakup, but a slow, quiet erosion. A petering out. He told me about it over the phone, his voice flat and distant. He was in Chicago, staring out of a hotel window at a city that didn't care he existed. He said they had both just realized they were building different lives, that their futures were two lines drawn on a map that were slowly, irrevocably diverging. He didn't sound heartbroken. He sounded hollowed out. He sounded tired. When he came back to town a few days later, he came straight from the airport to my apartment. He didn't call first. He just appeared at my door, his suitcase in hand, looking like a soldier returning from a war no one knew he was fighting. He didn't want to talk about it. He just wanted to sit on my couch and watch an old movie, something familiar and undemanding. And so we did. We sat in comfortable silence, the only sounds the dialogue from the screen and the gentle hum of the city outside, and I felt my role in his life solidifying. I was the safe harbor, the place he came to when the seas were too rough. For weeks, that was our new rhythm. His own apartment, the one he had once shared with Chloe, became a ghost ship he was reluctant to board. He spent more and more time at mine. He'd bring over groceries and cook dinner, filling my quiet space with the chaotic, wonderful smells of garlic and onions and something slightly burning. He'd leave a toothbrush in my bathroom, a sweater slung over my armchair, small, incremental encroachments into my territory that I welcomed with a silent, fluttering heart. He was weaving himself into the fabric of my daily life, and the lines we had always maintained, the unspoken but clear boundaries of our friendship, began to soften and blur. He was seeking a comfort that went beyond conversation, beyond shared interests. It was something more fundamental. It was a need for presence, for the simple, grounding reality of another human being in the room. He was lonely, not just for a partner, but in a deeper, more existential way. The constant travel, the high-pressure job, the performative confidence, it had all taken its toll, leaving him adrift. And he had chosen me as his lighthouse. The first time he fell asleep on my couch was after one of those dinners. We had opened a bottle of wine, and then another, and the conversation had drifted from his work stress to my latest project to abstract, philosophical nonsense about the meaning of it all. At some point, his voice trailed off mid-sentence. I looked over and he was gone, his head tipped back against the cushions, his mouth slightly open, lost to the world. A profound tenderness washed over me. I stood up, retrieved the thick wool blanket from the end of my bed, and draped it over him. His brow furrowed in his sleep, and he mumbled something incoherent, shifting slightly. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering in the air just above his hair. The urge to touch him, to smooth away the lines of worry on his forehead, was a physical force, a magnetic pull I had to actively resist. I clenched my fist and retreated, my heart pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm against my ribs. I turned off the lights and went to my own room, but I didn't sleep for a long time. I lay in the dark, listening to the new sound in my apartment, the soft, rhythmic whisper of his breathing. It was the sound of a boundary being crossed, a line being erased, and I was both terrified and desperately, hopelessly grateful. That one night became a recurring theme, a ritual we never discussed but both came to depend on. It was never planned. It would always start with a text from him in the late afternoon. "Brutal day. You around tonight?" And I always was. It became an unspoken understanding that my apartment was his default destination after a bad day, a long flight, or just a general sense of unease with the world. He'd arrive, shed the armor of his day at the door, and slowly, over the course of a few hours, the tense lines around his eyes would soften. We would talk, or not talk. Sometimes he needed to vent, to pace my living room and untangle the knots of his professional life. Other times, he just needed silence, and we would sit together, reading or listening to music, the space between us filled with a companionable quiet that was more comforting than any words could ever be. And, more often than not, he would fall asleep. At first, it was always the couch. It became his couch. I started keeping the wool blanket folded on the armrest, ready for him. I'd find him there in the morning when I woke up, a disheveled, beautiful mess amidst my cushions. He'd stir as I made coffee, blinking against the morning light, a look of brief, geographical confusion on his face before it settled into a soft, grateful smile when he saw me. "Morning," he'd mumble, his voice thick with sleep. "Coffee?" I'd ask. "Please," he'd reply, and we would share a quiet breakfast before he would disappear back into his own life, leaving behind a subtle lingering scent of his soap and the faint indentation of his body on my couch, ghosts of his presence that would fade over the course of the day. It was a strange, suspended reality we were living in, a domesticity without definition. We were playing house in a way, but without any of the language or commitment that would make it real. It existed in a liminal space, a gray area of unspoken needs and carefully unexamined gestures. For my part, I was living in a state of hyper-awareness, a constant, low-grade fever of anxiety and hope. My senses were perpetually dialed up to their highest setting whenever he was near. I was aware of the precise distance between us on the couch, of the way the lamplight caught the silver flecks in his dark hair, of the subtle shifts in his breathing that signaled his descent into sleep. It was exquisite torture. Every night he stayed over was a gift, and every morning he left was a fresh reminder of the precariousness of our arrangement. I was his safe place, his comfort object, his human security blanket. But what did that make me? And what did he mean to me? The answer to the second question was a roaring fire I was constantly trying to contain. The answer to the first was a question I was too afraid to ask, because I was terrified the answer would be just a friend. I analyzed every moment, every gesture, searching for clues, for evidence that this meant something more. I was like a detective examining a crime scene, dusting for the fingerprints of unspoken affection. The way he would sometimes reach out in his sleep, his hand landing on the cushion near my leg. The time he woke up with a start from a bad dream and his eyes, wide and panicked in the dark, searched for and found me in the armchair, and a visible wave of relief washed over him before he fell back asleep. These were the moments I collected, the small, precious pieces of data I would turn over and over in my mind, trying to assemble them into a coherent narrative, a story that ended with him feeling even a fraction of what I felt for him. It was an exhausting, obsessive process, this constant state of interpretation. I was a cartographer mapping the uncharted territory of his heart, using only the faintest, most ambiguous landmarks. The transition from the couch to my bed happened on a Tuesday in November. It was raining, a cold, relentless downpour that had been lashing against my windows all day, turning the city into a watercolor painting of blurred lights and slick, black streets. Julian had been in London for 2 weeks, a grueling trip that had left him jet-lagged and hollowed out. He showed up at my door looking like a ghost, his face pale and drawn, dark circles under his eyes. He barely spoke. He just walked in, dropped his bag, and collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in a cushion. I let him be for a while, just letting the quiet of the apartment settle around him. Later, I brought him a bowl of soup, which he ate without seeming to taste it. We didn't turn on the television. We just sat in the dim light of the living room, listening to the rain. Around midnight, he finally stirred, pushing himself into a sitting position and running a hand through his already messy hair. He looked over at me, his eyes glassy with exhaustion. "I should probably," he started, but his voice trailed off. The unspoken end of the sentence was, "Go home," but we both knew he wouldn't. He didn't have the energy. He looked at the couch, then he looked at me, and there was a new kind of vulnerability in his gaze, a raw, pleading quality I had never seen before. "Leo," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Your couch is." Lumpy, a small, tired smile touched his lips. It was a joke, but it wasn't. It was a test, a question wrapped in a complaint. My heart started to hammer against my ribs. The air in the room suddenly felt thick, charged with unspoken possibility. This was a threshold. I knew it. "My bed's not," I said, my own voice sounding strange and distant to my ears. I kept it even, casual, betraying none of the internal chaos that had just been unleashed. I was offering him a way out, a chance to laugh it off and take the blanket as usual. But he didn't. He just held my gaze, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, filled only by the drumming of the rain. It was a conversation happening entirely in the space between us, a negotiation of boundaries and needs that required no words. Finally, he nodded, a slow, almost imperceptible movement. "Okay," he whispered. And that was it. No grand pronouncements, no dramatic declarations. Just a single, quiet word that changed everything. The geography of our ritual was irrevocably altered. He followed me into my bedroom, a room that had, until that moment, been exclusively my own. It felt like allowing someone into the most private, central chamber of my fortress. He moved with a strange, hesitant reverence, as if he were afraid of disturbing the sanctity of the space. We didn't talk. The silence was too fragile, too loaded with meaning to be broken by clumsy words. We changed in a kind of unspoken, choreographed modesty, turning away from each other. I got into my side of the bed, the side I always slept on, and he hesitated for a moment before sliding in on the other. The mattress dipped with his weight. He was there, in my bed. The reality of it was overwhelming, a sensory overload. The clean scent of his soap, the warmth radiating from his body across the small expanse of sheet between us, the sound of his breathing, so close now, right next to my ear. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling. I lay on my side, facing him, my body rigid with a mixture of terror and elation. "Thank you," he said to the ceiling, his voice low and gravelly. "You don't have to thank me," I whispered to his silhouette. We lay like that for a long time, two separate islands in the same sea, the silence between us a living, breathing entity. I could feel the tension humming from him, the tightly coiled spring of his exhaustion and whatever else he was carrying. Slowly, tentatively, he rolled onto his side, so that we were facing each other in the dark. In the faint light filtering in from the street, I could just make out the shape of his face, the dark slash of his eyebrows, the curve of his lips. His eyes were open, and I knew he was looking at me. My entire body felt like a live wire. I was convinced he could hear the frantic, terrified drumming of my heart. This was it. This was the moment where the story could go in 1,000 different directions, and I was powerless to steer it. I could only hold my breath and wait for the turn. The ritual of sharing my bed became our new normal, though the word normal felt entirely inadequate to describe the charged, delicate ecosystem we had created. It was an arrangement born of his exhaustion and my unspoken yearning, a fragile truce between friendship and something more. It was never explicitly discussed. After that first night, he would just gravitate toward my bedroom when he was ready to sleep, a silent question in his eyes that I would answer with a simple nod. We established an unspoken etiquette, a set of rules for this new territory. We kept a careful, deliberate distance between us, a buffer zone of cool sheets that felt miles wide. We were acutely aware of each other's presence, yet we pretended we were not. It was a performance of platonic ease that required a staggering amount of effort, at least on my part. For me, those nights were a study in exquisite agony. Lying next to him, so close I could feel the warmth of his body, was like starving to death in a room full of food I was forbidden to touch. I would lie awake for hours, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, charting its course from the jagged, shallow breaths of initial tension to the deep, even cadence of sleep. I learned the subtle nuances of his sleeping self. I learned that he sometimes kicked in his sleep when he was dreaming, that he made small, soft sighing sounds just before he slipped into a deep sleep, that he always, without fail, ended up turning onto his side, facing me, as if drawn by some unconscious gravitational pull. In those moments, with his face only inches from mine, his features relaxed and unguarded in sleep, the urge to reach out, to trace the line of his jaw, to brush the hair from his forehead, was a physical, visceral thing. It took every ounce of my self-control to remain still, to keep my hands clenched into fists at my sides. It was a battle I fought every single night, and it left me exhausted and raw. I wondered what he was thinking, what he was feeling. Was this truly just about comfort for him? Was I nothing more than a warm body, a presence to ward off the loneliness of the night? He gave me no clues. In the morning, he would be his usual self, friendly and warm, but with a new, subtle layer of reserve. We didn't talk about the night before. We would make coffee, talk about our plans for the day, and he would leave, and the tension that had filled the apartment all night would dissipate with him, leaving me in a quiet, echoing silence, my bed still holding the faint warmth of his body. It was a maddening cycle of intimacy and distance. We were closer than ever, sharing the most private of spaces, and yet a vast, unbridgeable chasm of unspoken words seemed to lie between us. I was living in the space of a question mark, a perpetual state of what if, and the uncertainty was beginning to wear me down, fraying the edges of my carefully constructed composure. I was a photographer who could no longer see the world clearly. Everything was viewed through the distorted, hazy filter of my feelings for Julian. The crossing happened on a Thursday. There was nothing remarkable about the day. It wasn't raining, he hadn't just returned from a long trip, there was no external crisis pushing us together. It was just an ordinary day that had bled into an ordinary night. He had come over for dinner. We had watched a movie. And then, as had become our custom, we had retreated to my bedroom. But that night, the air was different. The usual tension was still there, but it was overlaid with something else, something softer, more pliant. The silence didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like a vessel, holding a shared, unspoken emotion. We lay facing each other in the dark, the distance between us seeming smaller than usual. I could see the faint glint of light in his eyes, and I knew he was awake, and I knew that he knew that I was, too. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was full of everything we had never said, every hesitant gesture, every shared look. It was the culmination of months of this strange, beautiful, painful dance. I could feel my own resolve beginning to crumble. I was so tired of the fortress, of the carefully guarded walls. I wanted, more than anything, to tear them down. But I was a coward. I was too afraid of what I would find in the rubble. And then, he broke the silence. His voice was a bare whisper, so quiet I almost thought I had imagined it. Leo, my heart stopped. Or maybe it started beating for the first time. I couldn't tell. I managed to make a sound, a faint, questioning hum. He was quiet for another long moment. I could hear him take a breath, a slight, unsteady intake of air. "Can I ask you something stupid?" The phrase was so quintessentially Julian, a way of deflecting the seriousness of what he was about to say, of giving us both an out. "Always," I whispered back, the word catching in my dry throat. Another pause. A lifetime seemed to pass in that small pocket of darkness. I could feel the entire axis of my world tilting, preparing to shift. And then he said the words. The words that would either shatter everything or build it into something new and whole. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The question was not one of passion, but of permission. It was the most vulnerable thing I had ever heard him say. He was laying down his arms, stepping out from behind his own walls of easy confidence and plausible deniability. He was offering me a choice. He was giving me all the power. In that moment, the roaring fire in my chest, the one I had spent years trying to contain, burst free. It was not a destructive fire, but a cleansing one, burning away all the fear, all the uncertainty, all the carefully constructed lies I had told myself. All that was left was a simple, profound, and overwhelming truth. My internal world exploded in a supernova of silent, joyous light. I couldn't form a word. The path from my brain to my mouth was flooded, so I just nodded, a small, jerky movement in the dark. And then, because I was afraid he couldn't see it, I whispered the one word that my entire being was screaming. "Yes." He moved slowly, tentatively, closing the small distance between us. It was not a rush of passion, but a slow, deliberate drift, like two celestial bodies finally succumbing to a gravitational pull they had long resisted. I felt his breath, warm and soft against my lips, and then his lips were on mine. The kiss was not what I had expected. It was not hungry or demanding. It was gentle. It was hesitant. It was a question, an exploration, a confession. It was soft and searching, and it tasted of relief. It was the feeling of coming home after a long and difficult journey. I brought a hand up to his cheek, my thumb stroking the slight roughness of his stubble, and I felt him shudder, a deep, resonant tremor that ran through his entire body. He leaned into my touch, deepening the kiss ever so slightly, and in that simple, gentle pressure, I felt years of unspoken longing finally being answered. It was a conversation we were having without words, a dialogue of touch and breath and the frantic, synchronized beating of our two hearts. When we finally broke apart, we didn't move away. We stayed where we were, our foreheads resting against each other, our breath mingling in the small space between us. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say. The silence that returned was not the tense, questioning silence of before. It was a new silence. It was peaceful. It was whole. It was the beautiful, honest silence of a promise being made. The next morning, the silence was of a different kind. It was empty. I woke up slowly, drifting up from a deep and dreamless sleep, the first truly peaceful sleep I'd had in months. My first conscious thought was a warm, spreading sense of joy. My second was the realization that the other side of the bed was cold. I opened my eyes. Julian was gone. The only evidence he had been there at all was the slight indentation on the pillow next to mine and the faint, lingering scent of his shampoo. A knot of ice formed in my stomach, instantly extinguishing the warmth that had been blooming there moments before. I sat up, my heart starting a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I listened. The apartment was completely quiet. No sound of the shower, no clinking of the coffee pot. He was gone. I told myself not to panic. There were 100 rational explanations. He had an early meeting. He didn't want to wake me. He was just being considerate. I swung my legs out of bed and walked into the living room. His jacket was gone from the chair. His shoes were gone from the mat by the door. The wool blanket was folded neatly on the couch, back in its designated spot, as if to reset everything, to erase the progress we had made. It was a deliberate act of retreat. He hadn't just left, he had withdrawn. He had fled the scene. The beautiful, honest silence of the night before now felt like a lie, a fleeting illusion. The cold dread that was coiling in my gut began to feel sickeningly familiar. It was the fear that I had misinterpreted everything, that last night was not a beginning, but a mistake. A moment of weakness or confusion on his part that was now, in the harsh light of day, a source of deep regret. I sent him a text. Just one. Hey, you okay? I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity, watching the three little dots that signified he was typing appear and then disappear, and then appear again, and then vanish for good. The message remained delivered, but unread. Hours passed. The silence from my phone was deafening. Every notification from another app made my heart leap into my throat, only to crash back down in disappointment. The day stretched on, a long, gray expanse of anxiety. I tried to work, to edit the photos from my latest shoot, but the images on the screen were just meaningless shapes of light and shadow. The only image I could see was Julian's face in the dark, the vulnerability in his eyes just before he had kissed me. Had I imagined it? Had I projected my own feelings so powerfully that I had willed a mirage into existence? The next few days were a special kind of hell. The silence continued. My texts went from delivered to read, but they remained unanswered. My one call went straight to voicemail. He had erected a wall of silence between us, a wall so absolute it felt punitive. The hope that had been so carefully, so tentatively nurtured over the past few months collapsed into a pile of sharp-edged rubble. I felt foolish. I felt naive. I had let myself believe in the quiet language of his actions, in the unspoken intimacy we had built, and it had all been a fantasy. He had needed comfort, and I had provided it. And when that comfort had threatened to become something more, something real and complicated, he had run. The fortress I had built around my heart, the one I had so willingly abandoned for him, now seemed like a sensible, necessary structure. I had been a fool to ever leave it. The pain was sharp and constant, a physical ache in my chest that made it difficult to breathe. It wasn't just the pain of rejection, it was the pain of losing my best friend. The person I told everything to was the one person I couldn't talk to about this. The silence wasn't just an absence of his voice, it was an absence of my own anchor. I was adrift. After a week of this agonizing radio silence, something inside me shifted. The pain was still there, but it was now joined by a slow-burning anger. An anger at him for his cowardice, but also an anger at myself for allowing myself to be so passive in my own story. I had spent years observing, analyzing, waiting. I had let him set the pace, dictate the terms of our strange, undefined relationship. I was done waiting. I deserved an explanation. Not a text message, not an email, but a conversation. I deserved the respect of honesty, even if that honesty was going to break my heart completely. That evening, I put on my jacket, walked out of my apartment, and headed for his. I didn't know what I was going to say. I just knew that the silence had to end. I would not let our friendship, and whatever else it had become, die a quiet, unexplained death in the space between our two apartments. I would force a reckoning. When he opened the door, he looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. His eyes were shadowed, his hair was a mess, and he was wearing a wrinkled t-shirt and sweatpants. He looked startled to see me, and then a wave of something that looked like guilt, or maybe fear, washed over his features. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, blocking the doorway, a human barrier between me and the answers I needed. "Julian," I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "We need to talk." He flinched at the sound of my voice, as if it were a physical blow. He ran a hand over his face, a gesture of profound weariness. "Leo, now's not a good time." "No," I said, and I took a step forward, forcing him to take a step back into his apartment. "We're doing this now. You don't get to do that. You don't get to kiss me like that, and then just disappear. You don't get to treat me like a stranger." He finally looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the conflict raging in his eyes. He looked trapped. He let out a long, shuddering breath and stepped aside, a silent invitation to enter. His apartment was a mess. Clothes were strewn over furniture. Takeout containers littered the coffee table. It was the physical manifestation of his mental state, chaotic, neglected, and unwelcoming. It was the opposite of my place, the opposite of the sanctuary I had created for him. He didn't offer me a seat. He just stood in the middle of the room, his arms crossed over his chest, a defensive posture. "What do you want me to say, Leo?" he asked, his voice low and strained. "I want you to say the truth," I said, my voice quiet but firm. I want you to tell me why you ran. Was it a mistake? Were you drunk? Were you just confused? Whatever it is, just say it. I can take it. What I can't take is this. This silence. It's cruel, Julian. He looked away, unable to meet my gaze. He paced the small space between the couch and the window, his movements agitated, restless. He was the storm again, but this time it was contained within the four walls of his apartment and within the confines of his own skin. It wasn't a mistake, he finally said, his back still to me. His voice was muffled. That's the problem. It wasn't a mistake. He turned around, and his face was a mask of anguish. I don't know what's happening, Leo. I don't feel this way. About men. About anyone, really. Not like this, he was finally confessing. Not his feelings for me, but his fear of them. He was struggling to reconcile his actions with his own self-perception, his own identity. The kiss hadn't just been a kiss for him. It had been an earthquake that had shattered the foundations of who he thought he was. Everything with you is just easy, he continued, his voice cracking with emotion. Being at your place, it's the only time my brain shuts up. It's the only place I feel safe. And I needed that. I needed you. But I didn't let myself think about what it meant. And then that night, I looked at you, and I wanted to. I wanted to kiss you more than I've ever wanted anything. And it felt right. It felt so terrifyingly right. And the next morning, I woke up, and I panicked. Because if it was right, then what does that make me? What does it mean for my entire life up to this point? I didn't know how to face you. I didn't know how to be in the same room with you without wanting to kiss you again, and that scared the hell out of me. So I ran. I ran because I'm a coward. He finally collapsed onto his couch, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. All the anger I had been holding on to dissolved, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified of accepting himself. He hadn't been running from me. He had been running from the truth. I crossed the room and sat down next to him, not touching him, just closing the distance. I let him cry. I let the confession hang in the air between us, raw and painful and, finally, honest. After a long time, his sobs subsided. He lifted his head from his hands and looked at me, his eyes red-rimmed and full of a desperate, pleading vulnerability. I'm so sorry, Leo, he whispered. I'm so sorry I hurt you. You're the most important person in my life, and I almost destroyed it because I was scared. The confrontation had opened the floodgates, and what followed was the most honest conversation of our lives. We talked for hours, the mess of his apartment forgotten around us. He talked about the pressure he'd always felt to fit a certain mold, to follow a pre-written script for his life. The successful career, the pretty girlfriend, the conventional future. He talked about the loneliness that had been his constant companion, a quiet hum of dissatisfaction beneath the surface of his seemingly perfect life. He admitted that his relationship with Chloe had been more about comfort and shared expectations than genuine passion. He confessed that the easy intimacy and profound connection he felt with me was something entirely new, a language his heart was learning to speak for the first time, and it was disorienting and frightening. I listened, and for the first time, I felt like I was seeing the real Julian. Not the confident, charismatic man who charmed everyone he met, but the vulnerable, uncertain person underneath. The man who was just as scared and confused as anyone else. And then, it was my turn. I told him everything. I told him about the housewarming party, about the way he said my name. I told him about the moment I realized my feelings for him were more than friendship, and about my conscious decision to bury them, to build a fortress to protect what we had. I told him about the exquisite torture of the last few months, of lying next to him every night, wanting him so much it felt like a physical pain. I laid my own heart bare, offering him all the pieces I had kept hidden for so long. As I spoke, I saw a new understanding dawn in his eyes. He was seeing our shared history through a new lens, reinterpreting the moments we had shared, realizing that the pull he felt was not one-sided, but a mutual, powerful gravity. When I finished, the apartment was quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of a storm that has finally broken, leaving the air clean and fresh. He reached out and took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. His touch was not hesitant or questioning. It was firm. It was certain. "I've been an idiot," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "A blind, terrified idiot. You've been right here all along." He brought my hand to his lips and pressed a soft kiss to my knuckles. "I don't know what this looks like," he said, meeting my gaze. "I don't have a map for this. But I don't want to run anymore. I want to stay. I want to figure it out. With you. If you'll let me stay," I said, my voice choked with relief. It was all I needed to say. It was all that mattered. The days that followed were like the first days of spring after a long, hard winter. There was a sense of newness, of tentative green shoots pushing their way through the frozen ground. We moved slowly, carefully, learning the new shape of our relationship. The ambiguity that had been a source of so much anxiety was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady sense of intention. The unspoken was finally being spoken. We talked constantly, filling in the gaps, coloring in the outlines of our shared feelings. We were two cartographers, finally working on the same map, charting the course of a new world we were building together. The rituals that had once been so fraught with tension were transformed. When he stayed over now, there was no pretext of exhaustion. He stayed because he wanted to be with me. Lying in bed was no longer an exercise in agonizing self-restraint. It was a space of comfort and affection. We could touch freely. A hand finding another in the middle of the night, a kiss on the forehead in the morning, the simple, profound comfort of his arm around me as we fell asleep. Each touch was a reaffirmation, a quiet declaration. The buffer zone of cool sheets between us was gone, erased completely. We had closed the distance. One Saturday morning, about a month after our conversation, I woke up to the smell of coffee. I opened my eyes and Julian was sitting on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, holding 2 mugs. He smiled when he saw I was awake. "Morning," he said, his voice soft. He handed me a mug. It was my favorite one, the one with a small chip on the rim. It was a small detail, but it felt significant. He remembered. He was paying attention. "I have to go," he said. "I have a project." He was being deliberately mysterious, a playful glint in his eyes. He leaned in and kissed me, a slow, lingering kiss that tasted of coffee and the promise of a shared future. And then he was gone. He was gone all day. He sent me a few cryptic texts, but wouldn't tell me what he was doing. I spent the day in a state of pleasant curiosity, editing photos, the quiet hum of my apartment feeling less like solitude and more like peaceful anticipation. That evening, he texted me, "Come over." I made dinner. When I arrived at his building, I felt a familiar flicker of the old anxiety, the memory of standing outside his door, steeling myself for a confrontation. But it faded as quickly as it came. This was different. I knocked, and he opened the door immediately, a wide, genuine smile on his face. His apartment was transformed. It was clean. It was organized. The chaotic energy was gone, replaced by a sense of calm and order. It looked like a home. My eyes scanned the room, and then I saw it. On the wall above his sofa, where a generic print from a big-box store used to hang, there was now a large, beautifully framed photograph. It was one of mine. It was a black-and-white shot I had taken years ago, a quiet, melancholic photo of the city skyline at dusk, the lights just beginning to glitter against the deep indigo of the twilight sky. It was one of his favorites. He had always said it captured the feeling of being both lonely and hopeful at the same time. He had built a home for my art. He had made a space for me, not just in his bed, but on his walls. In his life. I turned to him, my throat tight with an emotion I couldn't name. He was watching me, his expression a mixture of pride and nervousness. "I wanted this place to feel less like a hotel room," he said softly. "I wanted it to feel like us." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, shiny key. He pressed it into the palm of my hand. "So you don't have to knock anymore." I closed my hand around the key, the cool metal a solid, tangible weight. It was not a grand gesture. It was a quiet one. It was a key. It was an invitation. It was a promise. It was everything. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. We found that the loudest declarations of love are often the ones that are never spoken aloud. They are in the key pressed into a palm, in a favorite photo hung on a wall, in the shared, easy rhythm of making coffee in the morning. They are in this simple, profound, and brave act of choosing, every single day, to stay. Our story hadn't been a whirlwind romance. It had been a long exposure photograph, one that had taken years to develop, slowly revealing the image that had been there all along. An image of two people finding their way out of the shadows and into a soft, gentle light. A picture of a quiet, unassuming Tuesday night that had, against all odds, become the beginning of everything.